Yeah, this presentation is going to talk about one probable origin of that really commonly held story that whites deliberately spread smallpox in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm sure, I think this story is sometimes about the only thing that people, and I put this in scare quotes, know about the history of colonization in the Pacific Northwest. That somehow a genocide occurred. It's so common that there's lots of internet memes around this story about smallpox blankets. Now, a folklorist by the name of Adrienne Mayer has pointed out that this story follows the trope of many kind of common folklore stories. She says the smallpox blanket story may be based on historical fact, but it actually gains more credibility because it rests on centuries and centuries, millennia of poison gift stories, going back to ancient Greece. And there are many of those kind of poison gift stories. This one is the story about Medea gifting a poison dress to a rival and killing her as a result of this gift. And there are other such stories that go back in folklore and Greek and Roman mythologies. So the story about the poison gift is an old and ancient one, and it's a trope that I think our culture draws on. But there are, in fact, some documented examples of Europeans using smallpox blankets to try and infect Indigenous people in the North America. There's one documented instance that's the most famous of all, and this is the 1763 attempt by the subordinates of British General Jeffrey Amherst, who at Fort Pittsburgh, or actually Fort Pitt near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. They're fighting the Indigenous people, smallpox is around, and they deliberately take blankets from the smallpox hospital and gift them or trade them into the Indigenous community, hoping that this will adversely affect their adversaries, the Indigenous adversaries. So this is the best documented, maybe one of the only documented examples. But Europeans also used these smallpox blankets against other Europeans in different kind of conflicts. So Elizabeth Fenn, an American historian, has documented cases of the Union Army deliberately doing the same thing with smallpox blankets to the Confederate Army during the US Civil War, for example. And in 2003, I was working on a website project on the Chilcotin War, and I came across, I think, the only documented example in the Pacific Northwest of two traders in the Chilcotin area who deliberately took blankets from graves of presumably smallpox victims and tried to trade them back into the Chilcotin community. So there are a few documented cases, but when people talk about the deliberate spread of smallpox, they don't know those two details. It took almost 100 years after the Amherst case, 1763, before an historian who was combing through the correspondence of Amherst actually discovered that they had deliberately tried to spread smallpox. So it took a century before that knowledge became accessible even to scholars. And I'm guessing that probably not many people in this room have that knowledge, and yet you still have heard the story that smallpox was directly or deliberately spread. So if the stories aren't based on historical evidence in the sense of we have a document or documents to show that, why is it that these stories are so widespread? And before I move on from that, if there are two documented instances of attempts to spread smallpox, that probably means there are other attempts that people didn't document, because that's not the kind of thing that you kind of, always write down for posterity. Well, my point today, one of my main points anyway, is that the story is so widespread because colonists here in the Pacific Northwest, and I imagine that's true elsewhere, repeatedly threatened to spread smallpox, and then smallpox would often follow. And so using vocal and public threats to spread smallpox and then having smallpox come, I think implants that infected blanket story in the minds of certainly Indigenous people and others as well. I'm not keeping up with my slides here, so just let's see slides. Go back to here. Chilcotin War. So I'll come back to talk about the Chilcotin War. So the smallpox, the blanket that I said was traded into the Chilcotin community in 1864. That's one of the contributing causes to to that war, and I'm going to return to that later in my talk. So smallpox, it turns out, is a very effective killer without human intervention or human acceleration. And the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, offers us a window into past smallpox epidemics because COVID and smallpox were spread in almost identically the same way. They're both spread through droplet infection that comes from when people cough or expectorate. The droplets hang in the air for a while. They land on a surface. You touch the surface, you rub it your eyes, your mouth, your nose, you catch COVID, and smallpox spreads exactly the same way. They've got roughly similar incubation periods, roughly similar infectability periods, if you like. And we saw how effective COVID was at spreading without needing any human acceleration, and smallpox spreads that well as well. Of course, the key difference is that the mortality rate for COVID is under 1%, and the mortality rate for smallpox was in the 30 to 60% range for unvaccinated populations. And interestingly, like the smallpox-infected blanket stories, COVID also produced its own kind of stories about deliberate spread of COVID. So as you recall from that period, the Americans were blaming the Chinese and said it was invented in a lab, and the Chinese were blaming the Americans and saying it was, and so all of this stories about deliberate attempt to spread any disease, we can see in the current time that these stories ought not to be taken, at least first glance, at face value, and we should examine such claims critically. So I guess my first argument here is that the stories about the deliberate attempts to spread smallpox actually don't depend on the evidence of the actual genocidal spread, but in fact are traceable to tactics of European power we can call bioterrorism. And by bioterrorism, I mean it's an attempt to control Indigenous people with the threat of deliberately spreading smallpox or other diseases. And with my colleague Keith Carlson, we've documented at least 10 different attempts in the Pacific Northwest between 1811 and 1864 where Europeans tried this tactic. Well, I'll say where Europeans, in fact, you'll hear that there's a couple of Indigenous examples of Indigenous people using the same tactic as well. And when I say Pacific Northwest, we're going to stretch from the mouth of the Columbia River up to the Makúk River, which is about a third of the way up the coast of British Columbia. I guess it's important to say at the outset that each of these threats, while they were credible to Indigenous people when they were made and profoundly effective, were in fact hollow. Throughout the era that I'm discussing, Europeans actually didn't have the technology or the skill or the knowledge to actually affect the bluff that they were making. And you'll hear that each of the different practitioners of the bluff had their own motivations, but they all had some specific motivation. The bluff threats were created in contexts where Indigenous people came to attribute the subsequent arrival of smallpox to these earlier threats. My second main argument is that bluff threats were incredibly credible to Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest at this time because they had no exposure to crowd diseases before Europeans arrived. And secondly, they had no notion of germ theory, which even in Western medicine, in the time period that I'm talking about, early 19th to the mid-19th century, germ theory wasn't a well-established notion among Western medicine. So at the time of the arrival, Indigenous people understood illness as a spirit sickness. It was generally believed that a shaman with potent spiritual powers could insert a malevolent spirit entity into a chosen victim, and that if that was left uncorrected, that would result in death. In the 19th century, Indigenous epistemology, as much as we can understand it today, spirit sickness could be carried and could be transported and transmitted into people or into objects. So oral histories and interviews with elders from across the Pacific Northwest are rich in examples of shamans unleashing invisible sicknesses on enemies. Yvonne Hadja, for example, who worked with knowledge keepers among the Coast Salish, explained that, quoting now, shamans could cause illness or death as well as cure, and a rich person might hire a shaman to kill someone. Magic, which could be used by anyone, was often used for evil. William Elmendorf, who was a scholar at the University of Washington, similarly recorded several detailed accounts of the malevolent use of what he called hate magic among the Twana, whose traditional territory is just across the Straits of Juan de Fuca from us here. A knowledge keeper Elmendorf interviewed explained to him that, and I'm quoting a little bit of a chunk here, a medicine man can use, and I'm going to try the indigenous word, hakted, but we maybe translate it as hate. A medicine man can use hakted against any person he doesn't like. That's a way of using his doctor power to hurt people. It's not the same as Siaks shooting his doctor power into someone. Mostly they used hakted against the whole family, or a foreign tribe, or a village. Then lots of people die one after another, and everything goes wrong with that family. This is called pulling down the foundations of that family. So each Pacific Northwest Indigenous community had spiritual healers, men or women trained in the rituals and possessing esoteric as well as herbal knowledge, who could be called upon both to diagnose and to treat people who had fallen victim to spirit sickness. Through prayer and song and appeals to spirit power and their own ancestral spirits, healers worked to pull from the patients a spirit that had been attached by some malevolent intention. And in this context, when fur traders or settlers threatened to send a deadly disease to Indigenous people, in that context, in the context of Indigenous belief systems, this was highly credible, in particular because Indigenous people, I make this claim, and I'm not sure tons of people will support this, but Indigenous people believe that Europeans possess spirit powers of their own that they didn't understand, and so they could send, they could have these kind of powers. The third argument that I want to make, or Keith and I argue, is that in the first 2/3 of the 19th century, the British and American traders to the Pacific Northwest were extremely vulnerable to attack and removal by Indigenous people. They were outnumbered, in the thousands to one situation. This was especially true in the earlier parts of the 19th century, but also true in the later parts in the 19th century in the more remote parts of British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. And there were a few incidents, including the destruction of the ship Tonkin, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, and the so-called Whitman massacre, which reinforced the anxiety of settlers that Indigenous people, they were very vulnerable to these large numbers of Indigenous people that they were surrounded by. So many or some of these fur traders and settlers, at least the 10 that I'm talking about, coupled their limited knowledge of smallpox and their limited knowledge of Indigenous belief systems together to manipulate and control Indigenous people. And as I will talk about later, some Indigenous people were not, they took advantage of this kind of threat to control their enemies or competitors. So instead of walking through all of these bluff threats, I'm going to group them into 3 categories, and I'll talk a little bit about each one. So the first one is a bluff threat to secure the trader's own security. The second one is a bluff threat to coerce Indigenous trade. And the third is to punish Indigenous behavior. So let's look first at the bluff threats intended to secure traders' safety and control Indigenous people in their immediate proximity. And the first of these examples is going to come from Fort Astoria, founded in 1811 by the Pacific Fur Company of John Jacob Astor, and it appears number 1 down on the far bottom left of this Pacific Northwest map. So the ship the Tonkin was a ship from the Pacific Fur Trading Company. It had established this post at Fort Astoria in 1811, and then it immediately went north to Clayoquot Sound to trade with the Chalmette, and it was captured, and the crew was destroyed or murdered, massacred, however you'd like to discuss. And so word of this reaches back to their fellow company associates at Astoria, and Ross Cox, who was working for Astor at Astoria, recorded this account. So this is Cox's words now. About 30 years before this period, and we're talking 1811, so 30 years before 1811, was the 1780s, when there was smallpox epidemics that swept through the Pacific Northwest before Europeans had arrived. About 30 years before this period, the smallpox had committed dreadful ravages among the Indians, the vestiges of which were visible on the countenances of the elderly men and women. The Western tribes remember it with a superstitious dread, of which chief trader, Mr. Duncan McDougall, took advantage when he learned that the Tonkin had been cut off. He assembled several chieftains from the local area and, showing them a small bottle, or something like this, declared that it contained the smallpox. Mr. McDougall promised that if the white people were not attacked or robbed in the future, the fatal bottle should not be uncorked. He was greatly dreaded by the Indians, who were fully impressed with the idea that he held their fate in his hands. They called him, by way of preeminence, the great smallpox chief. Well, historian H.H. Bancroft recounted the story in his History of the Pacific Northwest, and he quotes, he may have made this quote up because he does that, but he quotes McDougall as explicitly expressing this threat as the power of the weak. So this is Bancroft quoting McDougall, quoting, "You imagine that because we are few, you can easily kill us, but it's not so. For if you do so, you only bring greater evils upon yourselves. The medicine of the white man dead is mightier than the red man living." So subsequent reports, we don't only have Ross Cox's report. There are other accounts that affirm that McDougall made this threat, and we don't know whether it's cause and effect, but Indigenous people never attacked this small little vulnerable post at Astoria. So I'm going to bring this closer to home now. The next threat that I want to talk about is very local, and it comes from right where we're sitting, Fort Victoria, which was established here on the south tip of Vancouver Island in 1843. According to the reminiscences of Roderick Finlayson, here seen here in a later age, I think he was in his early 20s when he's here at Fort Victoria in this circumstance. The Fort Victoria was attacked by the Songhees people and their Cowichan allies in about 1844, about a year after the post was established. The HBC had insisted the Songhees compensate them for the cattle that the Songhees were harvesting in what they believed to be, their land and their territory. Songhees refused to compensate the Hudson's Bay Company, and so they marshaled their Cowichan allies and attacked the fort. Now, we only have, we have two accounts actually of this, but by and large, we have only Finlayson's account. Finlayson wrote that he used military intimidation to end the siege without bloodshed. He talks about first sending his translator out to ensure that no one was in a nearby longhouse, and then he demonstrated his power by blowing it to smithereens with the cannon. Their home destroyed, and fearing further reprisals, the Songhees relented and paid out compensation, thus cementing European control of what became Victoria, capital of the colony, capital of the province. I said we have only one account, and this, until I started working on the smallpox story, that was the only account that I knew, and I think any other historians that I've encountered. But another source, we revealed another source in the course of our smallpox research. A decade after the event, a British naval officer was visiting Fort Victoria, and he heard an account from the people at the fort of what was likely the same incident. And so his name was George Inskip. He was on the Royal Navy ship, the Virago, and it sounds like he may be offering us another version of the same event. So this is from Inskip. At one time, the Songhees people were very troublesome, and a story is told of their coming to take the fort. But the smallpox had been among them a while before, and many had died from its effects. One of the Hudson's Bay officers thought of a stratagem. He took a bottle, carefully sealed it up, and went out to the chief and said, "I have in my hand a bottle of smallpox, and I should be so sorry to have to use it. But if you are not all gone in 24 hours, I will break it and send the disease among you, and then it will escape, and you all know the dreadful consequences of such a thing." A great meeting was called amongst the natives, and before the time specified, they had all gone back to their proper districts. So this may or may not have been the same incident that Finlayson was describing, but there was the only one attack that we know of on Fort Victoria, so it's likely that it was. And we can't derive any cause and effect from this event, but that was the first and last Indigenous attack on the fort. A second related but different type of smallpox bluff was to coerce Indigenous people to trade something that they didn't want to trade, or trade it at an unfavorable price. And one such example comes thanks to the fur trader William Fraser Ptolemy, who heard a story from a Swinomish hunter and chief in September of 1833 at Fort Nisqually in Puget Sound. This story, though, is not, he heard it in Puget Sound, which is actually, Fort Nisqually is kind of near where the P is there in Puget Sound, but the story related to him by this Swinomish chief, who he calls Pensilkinum, is actually a story that comes from Cape Flattery, which is shown there, and it's number 3 on the slide. So Pensilkinum tells Ptolemy, says, he told a long story of the arrival of 2 American ships at Cape Flattery, and that the ship's captains threatened to send disease amongst the Indians if they didn't trade beaver. So that was a story recorded in 1833, some distance from the actual event, but not that far away. 7 years later, on board the same naval vessel, the HMS Virago, George Hills records what may have been the same event from the Makúk. So the Makúk are the people at Cape Flattery. So Hills says, a few years ago, the captain of a fur trading vessel, finding the tribe refractory, assembled the chiefs, and producing an empty bottle corked up, told them that it was full of skin sick. And unless his terms were agreed to, he would uncork it and destroy them all, which so frightened them that he had his own way without further trouble. In his research into this case, anthropologist Robert Boyd concluded that both of these stories, both of them about Cape Flattery, relate to an American captain by the name of John Dominus, who was captain of a ship called the Oahe and a consort, the Convoy. And I'm going to come back to them a little bit later in my presentation. But I'm going to give another case now of the bluff threat that combines both the defensive and coercive elements of smallpox bioterrorism. According to his own recollections, oh, here I'm getting behind in my slides again, Cape Flattery, where that event happened, and here, Fort Kamloops, John Todd. So here I'm relying on the recollections of John Todd, and he's an interesting looking character, isn't he? I think his house is the oldest building standing in Victoria, in Oak Bay. Anyway, we only know of this story from John Todd's recollections, which are a bit, as you'll hear, a bit self-aggrandizing. So, we take this as, one person's account. But so he was the HBC Fort post manager at Fort Kamloops on the Thompson River, and he was faced with 2 problems in 1846. First, the nearby Statum, or Lillooet people, were refusing to trade wind-dried salmon, essential as a winter food for the fort's men, and he heard they were assembling to attack the fort. So Todd, in his memoirs, describes riding over 70 miles from Fort Kamloops to the Statum fish camp at what's now at Pavilion. Here, let's go to this slide now, up at number 6 on the slide. So he travels with some of his men from Fort Kamloops. He tells them men to stay back to make a camp nearby, and he rides into the camp all by himself. He says a camp of 1,500 armed warriors. That must be an exaggeration, but okay, some warriors. And then he says, this is a stratagem. He says, haven't you heard? He's saying to the Stoughton. The smallpox has broken out at Walla Walla and other places. Oh, this struck them with terror. They were now perfectly dumb with horror of the smallpox, of which they had a perfect dread. And it was true. The smallpox was raging on the Columbia River. So stepping out aside, I don't think smallpox was raging on the Columbia River, just as an aside. According to Todd, they responded by asking, have you come to give us some medicine? Now the frightened savages inquired of me. And I said, I don't like to see you all lying around the ground dead like your fish there, pointing to the large quantity of salmon that they had drying along the riverbank. So Todd he had 2 goals in mind: to prevent the attack on his fort, but also to get salmon for his men. So he devised this kind of delaying tactic, if you like. So he said, he said, I'm going to vaccinate you all, but first of all, you have to cut down that giant tree over there and make me a big seat to sit on, because that's important for the performance of this thing. And in the meantime, he said, if your women want to go help and trade salmon to my men, that's where they are. They're over there. So in fact, he kind of delays the process. He starts the process of vaccination. I know some artists in the 1950s came up with this kind of recreation of this. I don't vouch for it as an accurate recreation of the event, but Todd began the process of vaccination, but with a particularly cruel addition of cutting especially deep cuts into the men of the arms that he deemed to be rascals. He says, now quoting again from, he says, they commenced to strip, and he called the women and children out of the forest where they had been concealed. My men had a fire in the woods, and I, pointing to the smoke of the camp, directed the women, who had lots of salmon, to take the salmon to my men, that I didn't myself want any of it. Off they went to gladly. When he finished a supply of vaccine, Todd told the warriors to keep their arm uncovered all day and not to touch anyone. Of course, I knew that by attending to my orders, there was no chance of any fighting going on among them, he said. By this time, they would have got down to worship me almost, instead of, as before, committing murder on myself and party. Anyway, we got back to Kamloops safely, and all the excitement and trouble passed over. So we learn from Todd's reminiscences, to the extent that we can rely on them, that through subterfuge, he was able to get the SÁNEČ to trade 10,000 dried salmon, and thereby saving his men in the fort from starvation in the winter, and by telling Indigenous people that they faced an imminent smallpox threat that only he alone could prevent, he ingratiated himself to the warriors who had earlier wanted to kill them. Now, Bancroft has written about this as well, and he actually interviewed Todd. So this is potentially from Todd, but anyway, he quotes Todd as saying, "Fear must be kept alive. The threatening wrath of the mysterious unseen power must be before them," before the Indigenous people. The third and final category of bluff threat was intended as punishment for particular Indigenous behaviors that had angered the bluffers. In 1840, the Chinook people of the Lower Columbia told a missionary who was working among them, a Protestant missionary, Jason Lee, that the smallpox had earlier carried off nearly all of their many people many years ago. So this is 1840 that they're telling Lee about it. But they're referring back about 10 years to the 1830s, where they say the cold sick was brought by Captain Dominus, that the King George people told them to give all the large beaver and salmon. So the King George people told the Indigenous people to give them all their large beaver and all their salmon to the HBC, and to give Captain Dominus the small ones. And he became very angry and told them that they would see by and by, and that they would all be dead before long. Accordingly, when he was about to leave, he opened his bottle and he let out the cold sick. So this is Captain Dominus punishing Indigenous people for trading their best furs to the King George or the Hudson's Bay Company people. Well, here's Columbia River. Now we're at sort of Fort Vancouver, number 4 on the, and actually we do have an image of Captain John Dominus, who was implicated in this, but also you remember in the Cape Flattery incident that I mentioned before. Well, scholars now believe that the cold sick that had infected the Columbia River in the 1840s was actually not smallpox, it was malaria. And unlike smallpox, malaria was spread, smallpox is spread person to person. Malaria, as you know, is spread by certain species of mosquito from infected person to infected person. Given the timing and the fact that the mate on Dominus's ship, Mr. Jones, the mate on the Hawaii, was reported as to be too sick to work and was actually convalescing at Fort Vancouver for a few months while Dominus was on the Columbia, it is actually likely that smallpox came to the Columbia River on the Hawaii and its consort, the convoy, and did in fact inadvertently spread malaria to the Columbia River, which was perhaps even more than smallpox. Malaria was devastating to that river valley. Variants of the punitive bluff threat were used again in British Columbia in the 1860s, which was then in the throes of a series of gold rushes. In March, as you maybe know, in March 1862, smallpox was carried to Victoria on ships from San Francisco, where it quickly spread into the Indigenous population in and around town. And from Victoria, which was a major seasonal gathering place for Indigenous people from throughout British Columbia, the virus spread and devastated First Nations in what's British Columbia's probably worst epidemic ever. I'm not really going to talk so much about the epidemic, but the bluff threat. So the best documented example is a punitive bluff threat in 1864 that helped spark the coordinated Indigenous resistance to settler colonialism in the Chilcotin Plateau. In May 1864, so I'm getting behind in my slides here. There's Fort Vancouver we talked about, but now I'm back up to items number 9 and 10 up on the top left of the slide. In May 1864, an identified man connected with a construction crew that was attempting to build a road from the outlet of the Homathko River in Butte Inlet to the gold fields of the Caribou assembled the Indigenous people who had been working on the road. And he was responding to the fact that over the winter, they just arrived in the spring, over the winter, the storehouse where they had left some supplies had been broken into and some of the supplies had been stolen. So this person whose name we don't yet identify, aren't able to identify, he asked the Indigenous people their names, he wrote them down in this book, and then he told them that as punishment for stealing their supplies, he would unleash smallpox among them. So when those Chilcotins saw their names taken down and heard themselves threatened with disease, they were only too ready to believe the threat. That last was a quote from a missionary who later talked to the Chilcotin. So here we have the mouth of the Homathko River where this threat was first made. Well, in this instance, the bluff threat backfired. A few days later, some 25 Chilcotin, led by a warrior named Platzacine, attacked the road crew. The threat to spread smallpox, we learned from the transcripts associated with his subsequent trial, was the main reason why he led the attack on the road builders. The attack ultimately triggered what's known in British Columbia history as the Chilcotin War and led to the death of 19 settlers as well as 5 of the Indigenous participants. 3 sources tell us about the smallpox threats, including one from a Chilcotin man whose name I'm going to try and pronounce as Achpikarmus, who was present when Platzacine, one of his attacks, and it's in the testimony of Achpikarmus that I'm going to relate this quote. He says, Platzacine said that the road crew were angry at Platzacine's men for stealing, and that one of them said that to punish them the next warm, meaning the next summer, he would send the smallpox amongst them. Platzacine said that in consequence he had killed all the white men at Butte Inlet, and that he was resolved to kill all the white men he could find. Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie, who tried Platzacine in the trial, the subsequent trial, he remarked that, quoting, "The threat acquired substance and force from the circumstance the same threat is said to have been made prior to the previous smallpox epidemic of 1862-63, when half their numbers on moderate computation perished." So other sources tell us that there was a threat made at number 9, Puncie Lake, in 1862, before the smallpox epidemic, the real big epidemic, broke out there then. And so we have those 2 incidents. So I guess it's interesting to note that although it was predominantly used by white traders and white settlers, it was not exclusively, the bluff threat was not exclusively used by them. On at least 2 occasions where we have documentation, the threat was used by Indigenous individuals to gain power over others. And the best documented example of that comes from the Columbia River in 1811, actually very close to the time that, we talked about the smallpox chief's threat, when a Kootenai or Tunaha prophet by the name, and I'm going to try and render this as best I can, Paumanupika, that prophet arrived at Fort Astoria after having transited or traveled down the Columbia River. And in the words of Robert Stewart, who was at Fort Astoria in 1811, he says, "A man and a woman arrived at Fort Astoria speaking the language of the Cree, which raised suspicion that he was a half-breed of the nations of the Northwest and a spy of the Northwest Company. If we had not taken him under our protection the instant he arrived, he would have been a victim of their dread that he would give them smallpox. He had the impudence, I'm not sure if it's imprudence or impudence, to boast of the power to do so. The chiefs of the Chinooks and the Clatsups frequently came to me begging that we surrender these two to them to kill them. So he had tried to extort furs out of the Indigenous people on the way down the Columbia by saying he had the power to spread smallpox. The other example of an Indigenous person claiming to have the power to unleash smallpox also comes from nearby the famous Dallas fisheries on the lower Columbia River in 1853. So now we're talking number 7 there on the slide. So 2 and 7, I guess, related. As in the case of Kalmanapika, the Wishram doctor, oh, here's the case here. The Indian agent reported, in a recent case, a doctor of the Wishrams, when the smallpox was raging, was foolish enough to threaten openly what havoc he would spread among them, making use of the pestilence to magnify his own office, and to surround his person with greater elements of power, boasting that he held the fearful quiver in his hands, ready to hurl the arrows of death in any direction. Well, this also backfired. Shortly after making his threat, the people rose in a body and hung him in the most barbarous mode, according to the Indian agent. So, the lessons from the 2 Indigenous examples and from the Chilcotin War demonstrate that in the face of bioterrorism, Indigenous people were not always cowed and sometimes saw an opportunity for action. Killing those who threatened to spread smallpox before they could do so was a logical response. These documented cases, 10 of them over 6 decades in different parts of the Pacific Northwest, must be only a fraction of the time that this strategy was used because, of course, as I said earlier, people don't always record the nefarious things that they do. So the existence of these documented cases suggests that this technique of terror to manipulate Indigenous people was used even more frequently than that. Moreover, we also know that news traveled very effectively through Indigenous networks. Stories of smallpox threats were undoubtedly transmitted over space and time and would have influenced dealings not only with the contemporary fur traders in the period that we're talking about, 1811 to 1860s, but in the subsequent era of settlement as well. So we know that American sea captains, American fur traders, British Columbian road crew, and Indigenous doctors all used the strategy of bluff threats to spread a deadly disease in order to exercise power over more than a dozen Indigenous groups we can identify within this span of 60 years. The motivations were different, but the technique was the same. Each claimed to have the power to release disease into Indigenous communities, and each used this threat to gain power. Well, not as egregious as deliberately spreading smallpox, the bluff threat was nevertheless a powerful weapon of intimidation and manipulation. It was used in some cases by Indigenous people, but I think we can understand this as essentially as a larger strategic goal on behalf of settlers to control Indigenous people and acquire the resources that these nascent colonists ultimately were successful in alienating from Indigenous governance and control. In most cases, the threats worked to soften Indigenous resolve, and in some cases had Indigenous people questioning their own spirit power and their future in a rapidly changing world. The bluff threat, both its immediate use and in the lingering fear that it installed, that whites might at any time in the future release, in the words, here quoting Stalo elder Old Pierre, release a sickness that no medicine can cure and no one could escape. This inevitably helped pave the way for settler Americans and British Canadian settler colonialism. For if Indigenous people had been reluctant to press any issue because they believed that a small number of whites on their ships down the river, across the bay, or over in the fort had the power to unleash a devastating disease, well, they're all the more threatened when these small number of traders were replaced by floods of settlers through the 1840s to the 1860s. The increasingly frequent and I think largely unintentional outbreaks of smallpox associated with the growing trade and communication between these emerging settler urban centers only served to reinforce the notion that settlers who had wanted Indigenous lands had tools beyond the physical power to enforce their will. And under these circumstances, it's not surprising to find that Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest, despite long delayed and broken treaty promises, were often reluctant to take up arms to defend their land and reluctant to launch reprisals for offenses. Many lived in fear that out of either revenge or mere capriciousness, the strangers arriving in their territory might at any moment release smallpox. Ultimately, the most lasting consequence of the bluff threat was that it formed the credible basis for stories that are widespread now, that when smallpox did arrive, it must have been intentionally spread. Originating more than 2 centuries ago, the bluff threats to spread smallpox facilitated the dispossession of Indigenous people from their lands, and to this day, the smallpox blanket stories continue to color settler-Indigenous relations. Recognizing that bioterrorism was a common strategy of early traders, which laid the foundation for future settler strategies of dispossession and oppression, offers an opportunity to begin the process of making amends.